The history of Spanish colonization is a complex and transformative era that reshaped societies across multiple continents. Beginning in the late 15th century, Spain embarked on a wave of exploration and conquest that fundamentally altered the fate of the Americas, parts of Asia, and Africa. This vast empire, at its height, spanned from modern-day Latin America to the Philippines, making Spain one of the most powerful colonial forces of its time. Understanding the influence of Spanish colonialism requires examining the social, economic, cultural, and political impacts it had on colonized regions, many of which still feel its legacy today. Spain's colonial journey began in 1492 when Christopher Columbus, under the auspices of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, set sail westward and discovered the Americas. What followed was an era of conquest, where Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro overthrew powerful indigenous empires like the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru. The Spanish Empire swiftly expanded, fueled by the extraction of vast amounts of resources, primarily silver and gold, from these newly conquered territories. This influx of wealth solidified Spain's status as a global power and financed its domination over various other regions. However, Spanish colonization was not just about plundering wealth. The Spanish crown sought to impose its religion, culture, and governance upon the indigenous populations. The Catholic Church became a cornerstone of Spanish colonialism, with missionaries dispatched to convert indigenous people to Christianity. This religious imposition had far-reaching effects. In places like Mexico and the Philippines, indigenous spiritual practices were suppressed, though many native populations syncretized their beliefs with Catholicism, creating unique cultural blends. The construction of grand cathedrals in colonized cities, often atop sacred indigenous sites, signaled the dominance of Catholicism and Spain's control. The social structure under Spanish rule was rigidly hierarchical. At the top were the Spanish-born peninsulares, who held the highest positions in colonial governments and the church. Below them were the criollos, or Spanish descendants born in the colonies. Mestizos, people of mixed indigenous and European descent, occupied a middle stratum, while indigenous populations and enslaved Africans were at the bottom. This stratified social system, known as the casta system, perpetuated racial divisions and maintained Spanish dominance over the colonized peoples. It also laid the groundwork for lasting racial and social inequalities that persisted long after independence. Economically, Spanish colonialism was rooted in the exploitation of native labor and natural resources. In the early years, the encomienda system was introduced, granting Spanish settlers the right to extract labor from indigenous people in exchange for their supposed protection and religious instruction. This system was notorious for its abuse and exploitation, leading to the decimation of indigenous populations due to overwork and European diseases. Later, the repartimiento system replaced the encomienda, but labor exploitation remained a hallmark of Spanish colonialism. The silver mines of Potosí in modern-day Bolivia, for example, became one of the most infamous sites of labor exploitation, with indigenous and enslaved African workers toiling under brutal conditions to fuel the Spanish economy. Culturally, Spanish colonialism left an indelible mark on the colonized countries. Spanish became the dominant language across much of Latin America, while in the Philippines, it influenced the local languages, contributing numerous words and phrases. Spanish architecture, art, and literature also took root in these regions. Cities like Mexico City, Lima, and Manila developed European-style infrastructures with grand plazas, palaces, and churches, reflecting Spanish tastes and ideals. Yet, amid this cultural imposition, colonized peoples found ways to preserve and adapt their own traditions, resulting in a fusion of Spanish and indigenous cultures. This blend can be seen in everything from food and music to festivals and religious practices, where indigenous and African traditions merged with Catholicism to create new forms of expression. The influence of Spanish colonialism also had profound political implications. Spanish rule in the colonies was highly centralized and bureaucratic, with a strict legal framework enforced by viceroys, who governed on behalf of the Spanish king. However, this centralized governance sparked resentment among criollos and mestizos, who were excluded from the highest levels of power. Over time, these groups began to identify more with their colonies than with Spain, planting the seeds of independence movements that swept through Latin America in the early 19th century. Revolutionary figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín emerged, inspired by Enlightenment ideas of liberty and self-determination. Their struggles for independence were not only reactions against Spanish rule but also against the deep-seated racial and social hierarchies that Spanish colonialism had entrenched. Beyond independence, the legacy of Spanish colonization continued to shape the newly formed nations. Economically, many former colonies remained dependent on exporting raw materials and agricultural products, much as they had under Spanish rule. The dominance of large landowners, or hacendados, who controlled vast estates worked by indigenous laborers, persisted as a legacy of the colonial era, contributing to widespread inequality. Politically, the centralized systems of governance established by the Spanish often led to the rise of authoritarian regimes in post-colonial states, as elites sought to maintain power and control over their fragmented societies. In the Philippines, Spanish influence extended beyond the Spanish-American War of 1898, when the country was ceded to the United States. Spanish colonial rule left a deep imprint on Filipino society, from the predominance of Catholicism to the enduring influence of Spanish names, customs, and laws. Even after gaining independence, the Philippines' colonial history shaped its national identity and societal structures, just as it did in Latin America. Moreover, the cultural impact of Spanish colonization extends globally, with the spread of Spanish as a language spoken by millions of people across Latin America and the world. Latin American literature, music, and art, deeply influenced by the colonial experience, have become global phenomena. The fusion of Spanish and indigenous cultures created distinct national identities that celebrate their mestizo heritage, while also reckoning with the painful legacies of conquest and colonization. Today, the legacy of Spanish colonialism is visible in the social and economic inequalities that persist in many former colonies. Indigenous populations, in particular, continue to struggle with marginalization and poverty, often as a direct result of colonial policies that dispossessed them of their lands and resources. Efforts to reclaim indigenous identity, land rights, and cultural heritage are ongoing in many countries that were once under Spanish rule. In summary, Spanish colonialism was a transformative period that reshaped the world. Its influence on the countries it colonized is deep and multifaceted, touching every aspect of society, from language and religion to politics and economics. While the Spanish Empire may have dissolved, its legacy lives on in the cultures, institutions, and struggles of its former colonies. Understanding this history is key to understanding the modern world, as the echoes of Spanish colonization continue to reverberate across continents, shaping the identities and futures of the countries that once formed part of its empire. If you like this video, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos.